Okay, so if you could just say that you agree with the recording, that would be fantastic. So we will be finishing in an hour because Senator Bernard has other commitment. She told us that she's very busy day today, and so I'm very, very grateful to have her with us. Before we start, I would like to have Danny Bourne to have the prayer for Vincent, and this way we can. So if you could start, Danny, I would appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. A prayer to Saint Vincent. Dear Saint Vincent, bless us and those we serve today, tomorrow, and always. Please help us to continue on the path you have given us. Please help us to keep our minds, our hearts, and our hands opened and ready to reach out to our friends and neighbors in need. Help us to remain strong in our conviction to social justice and equality for all. May we always honor your name by our words, actions, and prayers. May we find ways to encourage change among our leaders that demonstrates respect for the human dignity of everyone. May we continue to inspire and be inspired by your example of humility, simplicity, and love for all persons living in poverty. Amen.
Amen. And Corey, if you could read the Indigenous land acknowledgement.
While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands and water that we are on today, and the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their histories, laws, faith traditions, cultures, and their concerns regarding our shared environment, including safe water. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home.
Thank you, Corey. We are part of I'm part of a subcommittee called the National Advocate Subcommittee, and we are proposing Canadian to start having a conversation about the guaranteed basic income for every adult that needs it. We would like to see that conversation extended within our SSVP conferences, our family, friends, into our community, and hopefully reaching politicians at all levels. As we just mentioned with Senator Thomas, Thomas Bernard, she would like to see this conversation becoming maybe an election issue at the next federal election. So, and I would like to present to you, before presenting Senator Bernard, I would like to mention that Linda Dollard is with us. She is chair of the Société Saint-Vincent-Paul in Canada. I don't know, Linda, if you could just say a few words.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. And I want to take this time to thank the Senator for taking time out of her very busy schedule to join us today to talk about basic income and Bill S-233 being a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income and how it is an effective and affordable means of alleviating poverty. As members of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, this topic is very important and so relevant to our mission of helping people in need. It's great to see so many people on this call and to hear more about this very important topic and what we as Vincentians can do to help. So thank you very much, Senator. Back to you, Denise.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if Omar Eli is with us. If not, he's the Vice President of Social Justice on the board. So I would like to present Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. She is the first African Nova Scotian woman to be appointed to the Senate of Canada. representing the province of Nova Scotia in her hometown East Preston. Senator Bernard champions issue impacting African Canadian and people living with disability. She is particularly invested in people's rights, employment equity, mental health. Through her involvement in community projects, her social work career, her time with Dalhousie School of Social Work, and now her work in the Senate, Senator Bernard has maintained a deep dedication to social justice and racial justice. Senator Bernard advocates the reparation for historical and continued anti-Black racism impacting the lives of African Canadians. I present you Senator the Honorable Wanda Thomas Bernard, and thank you for speaking to us about the guaranteed income, basic income.
Thank you so much, Denise, for your introduction and for your welcome. I do have a PowerPoint that Philippe is going to pull up, and while he's doing that, transitioning from one set of slides to another. Oh, you were so quick. I want to let you know I'm joining you from my home in East Preston, Nova Scotia, which is part of the Mi'kmaq territory. And I'm grateful to live, learn, and continue to enjoy living here. So I've been invited by your organization to talk about a guaranteed livable basic income. We'll go to the next slide. I truly want to thank you for inviting me here today to talk about this. And I have to talk to you about a guaranteed livable income through my own journey, because it's that journey that grounds me. And also it's that journey that fuels my passion for this work. Then I will talk a bit about Bill S-233. And I'll talk about social location and intersectionality and why they matter. And then what's holding us back. What's holding us back. And I hope that leads us into a really nice discussion during the Q&A. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please. That's me sitting on the chair, my 18-month-old self and my older sister, Valerie. She was about 3. That picture is taken in our yard in East Preston, where I now live. I call it the early years in East Preston. I don't even know how I found that photo, but I discovered it a few years ago. And it's so grounding because it reminds me, not that I need reminders, mind you, but it tells the story of how we grew up in poverty. We grew up in poverty. We were poor. We were very poor. We were very poor before our father died. And our father died when I was 12. Valerie was 14. Our mom was 39 years old. And she had really 13 children, 10 that were born to her and our dad. And she raised 2 grandchildren and a godchild. I don't know if in your faith you have godparents, but we certainly do in our community. And we had a god sister. My mom had a godchild whose parents both died when she was young. And mom and dad took her in as well. So if you can imagine being 39, being widowed, your oldest child is 18 years old and your youngest is 18 months old. And as I said, we were poor before he died, and he was killed very suddenly in a car accident, days before his 40th birthday. It was tragic, and I remember it as though it happened yesterday. And it was a long time ago, but I still remember. And I remember the place where we grew up. I remember the home we grew up in. I remember not having enough food. I remember going to bed hungry. My sister Valerie and I, at the age of 12 and 14, when Dad was killed, we stepped up to help our mother with the younger children. We had 3 older brothers, but things were very gendered in those days as well. And it was the older girls, with the exception of an older brother who was 18. He helped a lot, but my other brothers who were older than us, they got a pass. They had a pass. And my sister and I took a lot of responsibility to help Mom. And because of the racism and sexism and poverty that she grew up with, she only had a grade 8 education. She used to work as a domestic worker. Some people might use the term a maid. That was the only job she could get. And after our father died, she had to work full time. But I remember Mom, in those days, she was making $5 a week. I was appointed to the Senate in 2016, literally on the anniversary, I think the 16th anniversary of my mother's death. We'll go to the next slide, please. That's my mom, Marguerite Thomas Perrant. When I think of her and I think of how frightening it must have been for her to suddenly be a single woman, and my dad had a little bit of insurance, but not a whole lot, how she kept us together as a domestic worker. But I'll tell you how she managed to keep us together. She continued to work because work was important to her, work was empowering for her, but she couldn't feed us on $25 a week. She was able to receive social assistance. I call it, some of you may have heard me speak about this, I've spoken about this in different conferences, but I call it the guaranteed basic income of the 60s and 70s. My mother had a basic income, but I remember social workers coming to our home, and I remember conversations. And I was a kid, but I was always very observant, taking everything in. And I remember conversations about Mom working and how important it was for her to work, but also recognizing that the money she was earning just wasn't enough to look after us as a domestic worker. And she was a domestic worker through no fault of her own. My mom loved education, and she wanted to go on to further education, but the segregated school in our community only went to grade 8. And if you wanted to go beyond grade 8, your parents had to pay to send you to school in the city. And my mother's father refused to send her because of her gender. He didn't think it was necessary to educate a young woman. But can you imagine? My mother went back to school after becoming a widow and raising this family and doing days work. She went back to school to give herself more opportunities, and she got her GED. And so that was quite amazing. So when I think about a guaranteed basic income, and I think about how important it is, and I think about the help that we received, that help that made it possible for my mom to keep us together, to raise us, I know that it was that guaranteed income that she had that made all the difference. But I also know that she and us, we were seen differently by society, by the system, because we were seen as the deserving poor. I'm going to talk a bit more about that a bit later, but we were deserving poor because my mom was a widow. So we'll go to the next slide. So let's talk about Bill S-233. To have a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income, it would basically create a standard that could pull many people, many people and their families out of poverty. It would be a national framework. What's considered livable in Nova Scotia, in rural Nova Scotia, may be very different than what's livable in downtown Toronto or Vancouver. So a national framework would take that broader geographic context into consideration. It would also account for other benefits. What other benefits do people have access to? But at the end of the day, it would be about creating opportunities for equitable access. We're talking about equitable access to a dignified and a healthy life. So let me tell you, although we grew up poor, we lived a dignified life. We lived a dignified life because my mother could work and still receive, she could work the entry-level positions that she was able to get, still couldn't support us. But she was able to have this guaranteed income until that 18-month-old became an adult. It made all the difference. It made our lives more meaningful. It made us more mentally healthy. And it kept us together as a family. I've seen, as a social worker, I've seen far too many families being separated and destroyed because of poverty and what poverty does to you. So this bill has so much potential, but there's so much resistance. There's a political football happening with this bill. It stuck, the Legal Affairs Committee did its study. They've made amendments to the bill, but it's not being allowed to come forward for third reading and a vote at third reading. And that is so fundamentally wrong. I want to come back to that, and I'm sure someone's going to ask me a question about that. We'll go to the next slide, please. Our social location really impacts our perspectives on poverty, our experiences with poverty, and our thoughts about poverty. So when I think about intersectionality, I think about power and privilege. So in which of these spaces do we have power and privilege? And how can we use the power and privilege to move the dial on poverty? People who are in positions of power and privilege often have a lot of discrimination against those who are living in poverty. An old colleague of mine, Ann Bishop, she wrote the book Becoming an Ally, maybe 30 years ago. But one of the things she would often say is that class is the glue that keeps all of the other oppressions intact. So if we think about class as the glue, and that poverty helps to keep all of these other structural oppressions intact. And I absolutely agree with that. We'll go to the next slide, please. So when I think about the benefits of a guaranteed livable basic income, and we're talking about a guaranteed livable basic income, basic, it would reduce stigma. We grew up on social assistance. We didn't have stigma attached to it because we were seen as deserving poor. Economic stability. We experience economic stability because of that basic income. It improves overall quality of life. Our mental state matters. And so growing up in poverty has an impact on how you see yourself and how other people see you. But if your basic needs are being met, if you're being treated with dignity and respect, and if you are being encouraged, it matters. I told you about my sister and I in that picture. We ended up being the two of the first 3 people from our community to go to university. And we were given that opportunity to go to university because our mom was a widow. Again, the deserving poor. A guaranteed livable basic income is cost effective. You think about the number of people who live in poverty, who end up in emergency health care systems because their basic needs are not being met. And then again, one of the benefits is that everyone is eligible. And so if you start with that fundamental basic belief that not only should this happen, but why it should happen and how it would help. And we've had some pilot projects in this country. Let's go to the next slide, please. Some pilot projects that have really demonstrated the significance in terms of quality of living. So this was a study on the pilot that was done in Ontario before there was a change in government a few years back. But imagine 88% identifying that they experience less stress and are less anxious. And 73% identified less depression. Depression and anxiety are 2 of the most significant mental health issues that people dealing with mental health illness are dealing with. Anxiety and depression, and how much of that is linked to poverty. And not just being linked to poverty, but linked to how they're treated because they're living in poverty. See, it's one thing to live in poverty. It's another thing to be treated badly because you're poor. It's wrong. 28% were able to stop using food banks. 74% were able to make healthier food choices. And I want to put the stress on that. We're able to make healthier food choices. The cheaper foods are the least healthy foods. The healthier the food choices, the more expensive they are. This is what we're dealing with, and we can add that to that previous slide on cost. We'll go to the next slide. So if we think about this bill and who might benefit from this bill, think about who are the people living in poverty. A number of people and our systems like to talk about child poverty. And I always say, listen, children don't live in poverty. Their parents do. So it's largely women, women raising children on their own, living in poverty. Sexually diverse groups, gender diverse groups, overrepresented amongst the poor, racialized people, indigenous people, people of African descent, overrepresented amongst the poor. In this country, there are some communities in this country where you would think it's a third world country and not a first world country. And then people with disabilities. In all groups, persons with disabilities are the most disadvantaged. And I'll tell you, my greatest disappointment with the most recent budget out of Ottawa is what's been proposed for the disability benefit. I was a part of the group that studied that bill and the promises we made to persons with disabilities that came before our committee. And it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating. The promise of that bill was that it would lift people with disabilities out of poverty, and then to create a benefit of $200 a month. and not bring it into effect until 2025? It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling. We will go to the next slide, please. So the question I ask is, what's holding us back? I believe a lot of prejudice is holding us back. Prejudice and discrimination are holding us back. Unconscious bias is holding us back. And ultimately, the biggest issue, I think, is there's a lack of political will. That's why I believe this needs to become a political, an issue for our next election. But people who are living in poverty don't have a lot of political power. They don't have a lot of social capital in the political world. So those of us who do need to become allies for those who are not able to speak in these spaces. But these issues need to come to the forefront. And we need to put them there. We need to create the political will to have the courageous conversations. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So when I think about what is holding us back, I think it's still rooted in the Elizabethan poor laws and the notion of deserving and undeserving poor. I think those are the basic issues that we're struggling with. We still have this image of deserving and undeserving poor. And as long as we do that, that feeds the unconscious bias. It feeds the prejudice and the discrimination. And they become the biggest barriers for people who are living in poverty and trying to break their way out of it. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to break out of a cycle, multi-generational cycle of poverty. We'll go to the next slide. So these are some questions for you to think about. And I hope that they may come up in our conversation. I'm wrapping up very shortly. So, one of the questions I like to ask people is, what messages did you receive when you were growing up about poverty? I've already told you I grew up poor, but I even received messages growing up about the undeserving poor in our community. What messages about people living in poverty? What were some of those messages? And I remember some of the messages I received about poverty when I was growing up and living in poverty. What did you learn during the pandemic about a livable income and poverty? When I think about the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, and how quickly government was able to implement that. If there was ever a time that we could have transitioned from CERB to a guaranteed livable income, that would have been it. But again, looking at, there wasn't the political will to make that happen. And so it didn't happen. And then we also had the Canada Emergency Business Account, CEBA, and the CEBA loans. And what messages did they send us about poverty? There are a lot of small business owners in this country who never recovered from COVID. That's my timer. I set my timer because I wanted to make sure we had good time for discussion. And that's almost perfect. I'll just take a couple of more minutes, Denise.
Perfect. Yeah.
But when I think about the business loans and the small business owners and people who weren't able to survive post-COVID, think about those small business owners who received the loans. And I think about the big corporations who were given grants. What's wrong with that picture, right? And then, I'd like to throw out this question to everyone on the call. What resistance do you see in your social circles about a guaranteed livable basic income? The circle that we associate with. What resistance do you see there? I hear the comments often. So I think we'll stop the slideshow. We'll go to the Q&A, and then when we wrap up, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to this last slide, Philippe. Thank you. Come back to
So-
that last slide. So we'll shut down the slideshow for now.
Yep,
When people are able to ask a question, if they could put on their
on the
cameras
chat, yeah. So
or
if,
put it in the chat, yes.
so thank you so much. That was, I think it was a very good summarize of the bill and everything. But one of the question, and you mentioned it, is why is the bill being not allowed to come forward for the third reading?
This is why I call it a political football. So there are people that don't support the bill. And when we're trying to move things from one stage to another, we try to get consensus with all groups. And there are some groups that just don't support a guaranteed basic income. Some senators don't support it. And so they use their power to stop the bill from going forward.
Are they
That's
they
basically
are they telling you why they don't support it, or they just don't
no.
support it?
And they don't have to.
Okay.
But you know it's because of discrimination. You know, it's some of those attitudes. It's the attitude towards people living in poverty, blaming people. As a social worker, you know, I've worked with people in poverty all of my life. And I don't think I've met a person yet who's decided, you know, I'm poor, and when I grow up, I'm going to be poor.
Mhm.
I'm going to be more poor. Like, or, you know, people who are dealing with addictions and people dealing with mental health issues, people living with disabilities. I've not met anyone who decided, you know what, I think when I grow up, I'm going to be an alcoholic.
Mm.
And I think alcohol, you know alcohol might destroy my life, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like, that's very unlikely. So I think we do a lot of victim blaming.
Mhm.
We do a lot of victim blaming. And as I said, a lot of people, I know the struggle of living in poverty. As I said earlier, I know what it's like to go to bed hungry. I've gone to bed hungry as an older daughter. My sister Valerie and I, we were quite strategic in terms of what things we did to help mom. So I was very keen. I love to cook. And so I did a lot of the cooking. I could braid. So I used to braid my younger sister's hair. So a lot of the home care things, the taking care of the children and food, that was my territory. My sister liked to clean. And I hated cleaning. So I was very happy for her to do the cleaning. And I did the cooking and homework with my younger siblings and that sort of thing. Where was I going with that story? I started
Yeah,
to tell
you were
you that
talking
story.
about you're talking about the deserving and
Oh, yes, yes. And so, you know, I know that we were given opportunities because we were seen as deserving.
There's a question that came and we talked about it. Is it perceived also as not for affordable? Like, is it the guaranteed basic income be seen as expensive?
I think part of what we have to do is look at how a guaranteed income could help, more down with some of the downstream issues. So if I'd look at many people who are in federal and provincial prisons, for example, if you look at the root causes of some of those issues that led them to be where they are, it's poverty. And so how much money are we spending to keep people in prison that those funds could be redirected? I also mentioned health and access to health care and access to preventive care. And a lot of people who end up in emergencies, the root causes of some of those critical health issues is poverty. And so we spend a lot of money on health care, not enough on prevention, especially for folks who really need it.
How important would be to have the provinces on board?
The provinces have to be on board. I don't know if any of you saw the food banks report card that came out this year. I don't know how many people are on the call from Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia was the only province that got a total failing grade on everything.
Oh, boy.
I was embarrassed to be a Nova Scotian. But it speaks to what we're not doing, not only in this province, but across the country. That report, I mean, there were some problems with the report, but overall, the report, looked at issues of poverty, looked at how we're doing, and as a country, we're not doing so well. And that's province by province. And I think that each of the provinces and territories have to do better.
So would you say that the funds could be coming from other programs that would be funneled through that program?
So that's one way that we can look at it. One of the other things that we often talk about in this country is generational wealth, multi-generational wealth. And I don't publicly support any political party. I do want to share one thing that the NDP talks about, which I think is something we should have more conversation about and consider. But part of their policy direction is a tax on the rich.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at government incentives to businesses, for example. There was an announcement about one just recently. And it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. So we can, as a country, as a government, we can find money for those investments that we want to make. But we're not keen to make investments in people that would lift them out of poverty. So the idea is that individuals should lift themselves up by their bootstraps and lift themselves out of poverty. And that's a very individualized notion of how we end poverty.
There is a question here. All the other social programs such as OAS, CCB, and SERB gave some same amount to each person. How complicated it would be to customize benefit to communities?
So I'm not an economist, but I think an economist could answer that question. I think if you haven't, an organization that you could talk to if you haven't already is the Center for Policy Alternatives. I believe they have offices in every province. Every year they come up with an alternative federal budget. And they usually come up with some really, really good suggestions, and they cost them out. They have economists that work with them. They cost them out. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think needs to happen.
There's a question here about, you were talking about the $200. Just a sec, yeah. Why the federal budget only gives $200 a month when people with disability were led to expect 2,000? If any group could be classified as deserving, surely it is people with disability.
I know. I was speechless. Honestly, I was really speechless when I saw that in the budget. $200 a month. And my mind kept taking me back to some of those conversations with the minister. And the minister at the time was a person with a disability who would spend a lot of time with disability groups across the country. And I'm thinking, I don't know how you could go to any person with disability in good faith to say that budget amount was okay. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sit well with me at all. And I know that every dollar we spend in this country on social issues is a dollar that someone wants us to spend somewhere else. So I know there's not enough there's not enough political will
Mm-hmm.
for the social program. I think about the late Alexa McDonough and all of the work she did to push, a more socially just government. And that's the kind of passion we need politically to move the dial on poverty.
There's Stella who asked, I suspect that there was likely pushback from the provinces to a GLA. Would it be good to know? It would be good to know, given poor federal-provincial relation at this moment. I suspect that one reason is probably among the others. Do you think that the relationship between the federal and the provincial right now is also could be an obstacle?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we've seen that. We've seen that at play with the national daycare work that's been a focus over the last couple of years. We're seeing it right now. Again, we saw it out of this budget around national focus to deal with the homelessness issues. And, no matter what the federal government does around some of these issues, I think there'll be some provinces that won't be happy. And so there'll be that conflict. I don't know if they're having the difficult conversations that need to be had. And I don't know what drives, individual provincial politicians. But what I do know is I think about Nova Scotia, for example, and income assistance rates. I think they went up this year. What was it? Something like $10 a month or something ridiculous like that. Like, how is that an increase when your cost of living has gone up probably almost 50%?
Is there anybody else who would has some question? Just raise their hand and maybe ask it verbally. But just yes, Elaine, use the button downstairs down because I won't see everybody. So Elaine, you had a question.
Yeah. So the question is, and I've seen a few people put it in the chat, how do we, as an organization, approach creating a conversation, say during an election? And elections are coming up. We know that in the next year. So are there tips that we can take away from this that would help us to go to debates that happen in constituencies, because we are all over the country, to raise that question? Like, would there be some very particular questions that I could put my hand up and say, candidates?
I think you're onto something really important strategically, Elaine. And that's one of the things you could do. Your organization, you've got some experts. I see. I'm only seeing a few names, but one of the names I see is Elizabeth K. Rainingbird. So you've got experts like that, on this panel, on this group, and you could, as a group, you could come up with a set of questions that any of your members could ask anyone. So it's going to a debate, but it's also asking the question when someone knocks on your door. So having a list of questions, if the organization could prepare a list of questions that you could send out, that would be really, really helpful, I think. Then you're not trying to think of something on your feet. And don't just think about this for the federal election. This is a question for provincial election. And also, it's a question we could ask municipal. I know municipal governments and municipal politicians don't get into this type of thing, but they're dealing with some of the consequences of poverty. And so you want to get people having those kinds of conversations as well. And we do that by asking questions. But strategically, if I were you, I would have a set of questions for each election that's coming up.
Thank you. I have Belinda Boyd. If you could unmute you, it's your time for your question.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You highlighted two areas of government expenditure jail, like prisons and healthcare that are impacted by poverty. They're not the only ones. There are many high, amount or high expenditures that are impacted by poverty. To Elaine's point too, how can we hold maybe more accountability for some kind of report card, because these expenditures, if I look at the province of British Columbia where I live, over 50% of government expenditure is on healthcare, and yet it is extremely impacted by poverty. The prison system, as you mentioned, how can we hold maybe more accountability on the outcomes of decisions as to where funding is going? Whereas if, to your point, we had basic income, we could raise everyone up and avoid these long-term impacts of government expenditures that are literally eating up all our revenue. So thank you.
Belinda, I think that was more of a statement than a question. And I all I can say is I agree with you. So you're asking, I think you were sort of saying, how can we do this? But I think you already have the answer. You raised the question. You ask the questions of your government. You write. I don't think we get enough advocacy on poverty. We get advocacy on everything you can imagine, but I don't think there's enough on poverty, because people aren't stepping into that space and asking the questions, asking
Ray,
the hard questions.
sorry, Ray, if you could, Ray Dark.
Ray,
Yep.
this is going to be the last question because we
Yep.
have a time check. We've got 10 minutes to go. So
Yep.
go ahead, Ray.
Okay, Senator, I just wanted to thank you again for agreeing to participate in this seminar. We're so happy that you've agreed to do this. I guess my question would be, I think that the general population is not informed enough about the potential benefits of a guaranteed basic income. And there are many countries around the world that have successfully applied models which incorporate this. Have any of those studies been looked at and been used to promote what basic income would do in Canada and how positive it would be to those living in poverty?
Absolutely. So in the study, the committee study of the bill, they certainly would have done that. Senator Kim Pate, she's the sponsor of this bill. Her team has put together a really good infographic that highlights the benefits of the bill, and with examples, from other countries. So there's a lot that we can do. One of the reasons why I start with my own story is because I think we can learn from that. We can take a lesson from that. We can take a lesson from that story. So there's a lot more that we could do to have the conversations. So I wanted to share these take-home messages. When I think about a guaranteed livable basic income, I think about dignity, and I think about equity, and I think about what we owe every citizen in this country, especially those who are marginalized in some way. It's that equity and dignity. Everyone deserves that, don't they? And how would we feel if we were treated without dignity and without equity? And then the other thing I just want to reinforce is that the resistance that we see right across the country, the resistance is really rooted in discrimination and bias. It truly is. At the end of the day, there's no other way that you can understand what's holding us back and why there's such a lack of political will. And so if we get to a national framework on a guaranteed livable income, we really have to start with creating opportunities for education and awareness. There's a fabulous film that was created in Nova Scotia. I don't know if some of you may have seen it. I'm sure some of you have. It's called 4 Feet Up. It's about poverty for a young family in the valley. 4 Feet Up, produced by Nance Ackerman with the National Film Board. I'm sure that film is about 20, 25 years old. But there's a line in the film that is just incredible. This young boy who I think the language, I'm sorry, I should always have my stories really clear before I talk about them in a space like this, because I'm missing part of it and I hadn't planned to talk about it. But this boy, people talk about, people who are marginalized in some way. And this boy at the time, he's 6 or 7 years old. He doesn't know what that means. But somehow, he's supposed to be responding to what life is like for someone who is experiencing marginalization and discrimination. And we often talk about these issues. We talk about people who are living on the margins in some way. And the people on the margins don't actually know they're on the margins. So I'll go back to my own journey for a moment, and maybe we'll end with this. We grew up really poor. We grew up dealing with a lot of racism. We grew up dealing with a lot of sexism. But we didn't know we were dealing with those things. They were happening to us, but we didn't know about it. So there's a need for a lot of education and awareness across the board, even for those who are living with the oppression. I will stop there. Thank you all very much, and thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for creating space for the courageous conversation, but also for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate it. And we want to encourage our listeners and to really talk about it. And because through our charitable work, it comes to what you were saying, Senator. Through our charity work, we observe that the reality for people living in poverty, we seek ways to improve their conditions. And we think that the guaranteed benefit income, basic income, is a proven way to help people in need regain their respect, dignity, and independence. It is an affordable solution to help people to grow out of poverty and become contributing members of the Canadian society. And we need to advocate the social policies such as the guaranteed basic income that works towards changing the root cause of poverty. And with what you were saying, you really, really bring this up. And there's some movement in Canada, you were talking about what's going on at the Senate and also at the House. And in Quebec, there's a basic income program that was implemented in January 1st, but it's not as wide as it should be, but it's at least a base. And we know that Newfoundland and PEI are talking about it, and some recommendations are starting to come up, but it's still stalled. I think what you're saying about the fact that there's a lot of deserving poverty and a lot of prejudice about poverty is really holding this all back. So we thank you very much, and I would like to really say how much we appreciate that you decided to spend some time with us this afternoon, and we hope to have this conversation expanded and to make sure that during the next provincial and federal election that we talk about this program. So thank you very much, and we'll ask Elaine to make a closing prayer. And again, thank you for everybody for coming this afternoon with us, and we much appreciate it. This will go on our site, the website, La Société Saint-Vincent-de-Paul, and also we'll have it translate so that even in French we'll be able to have it. So thank you so much for everybody.
Thank you.
And Elaine?
A prayer from South Africa. You asked for my hands that you might use them for your purpose. I gave them for a moment, then withdrew, for the work was hard. You asked for my mouth to speak out against injustice. I gave you a whisper, that I might not be accused. You asked for my eyes to see the pain of poverty. I closed them, for I did not want to see. You asked for my life, that you might work through me. I gave a small part, that I might not get too involved. Lord, forgive my efforts to serve you, only when it is convenient for me to do so, only in those places where it is safe to do so, and only with those who make it easy to do so. Forgive me, renew me, and send me out.
That's kind of a pointed prayer.
Yes. So
Thank you,
thank you,
everybody, for joining
everybody, and we have respected the 1 hour that we had, and much appreciated for your presence. And thank you so much, Senator. We appreciate your presence and your talk. Thank you.
Thank you again. I really enjoyed the time, and I saw a chat, Stella Lord. So it's nice to have some Nova Scotians in the space that I know have been doing a lot of work on these issues.
So